So today I'm here with another science fiction and fantasy wrap-up, and I'm happy to say that I like big books and I cannot lie. I'll leave it there because no one wants to actually hear me sing all the lyrics. But I wanted to do a video talking about some of the big books I've been reading recently. If you saw my winter TBR, you know that I've really been focusing on reading larger books this season, and I have been doing that. It has slowed down the pace of these reading updates, but I have some great books to talk about here, some books that I would recommend, some larger series that you might want to dip your toes into, and just want to know if it's worth your time. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about Limit. This is a book by the same author who wrote The Swarm, which I just pulled out here. And if you follow my channel, you'll know that The Swarm, this epic science fiction thriller, was one of my favorite books of last year. So needless to say, when that happens with an author, I then want to go and read all of their backlist. This is the only other book that my library had that is translated into English, and so I eagerly picked it up. This book is very long. I have to look at the page count, but I want to say it's about 1,000 pages. And this is a thriller that is set in a future where we have developed this elevator into space. However, it creates this space race between America and China as they're both going to try to get this resource that is very important, possibly will save the world, or at least be really important to humanity. We also follow the story from the perspective of this cyber detective who is looking for this girl who has gone missing. I like the story for the most part. It wasn't as good as The Swarm for me, but I went into that knowing that was probably the case. Looking at the early reviews on Goodreads, a lot of people said that same thing, and I kind of knew what I was getting myself into. So I do believe that The Swarm is their best work. I would recommend starting there if you want to get their best impression. But if you read The Swarm, love it, and want more, this is another one I would still recommend. It was still a 4-star read for me. It's very long and unwieldy in some ways. I do think that the book could have been edited down or structured a little bit tighter. There's a lot going on, a lot of different perspectives, and at times there were some brilliant aha moments, some really interesting parts where the author dives into some of the science and ideas behind the story, which is what I really enjoy. I've compared this author before to Neil Stephenson, and while I don't think he is quite up to that level, he's definitely in the same veins. So if you love a really chunky story that is very verbose and just, lots to say, saying it in a lengthy way, but everything they're saying is quite interesting, that's a very similar experience to what you'll get here. With the detective looking for the young woman, it definitely reminded me of Miller from The Expanse, although obviously its own thing. And there's just some good, exciting moments. Again, it really draws the line between being this heavy science fiction story, again, with lots of different conversations around politics and different nations and science and technology and all of that. But then you also have that thriller aspect to it, which I think he walks the line very well. Often books are so heavy in the science fiction that I'm cautious to recommend them to anyone who isn't just a big science nerd. But then you also have, again, this thriller element that to me was very exciting. I think if you love kind of the space race and tension within some of these other sci-fi thrillers, like in The Martian, there's also kind of that tension between the nations. You get something similar here playing out. Again, this book is long, and often you're going to hear me say in this video that I do think that things could be tailored down. Did I think that this book had to be that long? Not necessarily, but I still ripped through it. I thought it was interesting. I'm definitely interested in reading more of this author's work. I'll have to see what else is translated and I can get my hands on. So overall, recommend this one. Not necessarily the place to start with this author's work, but if you enjoy them already, definitely one to continue on with. Now let's switch over to some fantasy, starting with The Wandering Inn by Pirateaba. And this is a long-running serialized web series that has been turned into novels and is very popular, I know, on audio. And so at the point of recording this video, I've only read the first 3 novels. My original intention was to get caught up to the full publications before recording something, but that's just not going to happen in the short term. So I wanted to come and check in, let you know my feelings about the series early on, and then again, as I get later into the series, I can give an updated thought or opinion on the series as it goes along. So at this time, I've read the first 3 and I'm generally enjoying it. These books are incredibly long. If you're not familiar, they're over 1,000 pages each. And so if I wasn't enjoying it, I probably would have DNF'd them. So I think it's a good sign, the fact that I have gone on and read several of the books and have purchased several more to continue into the coming months. So you definitely will hear back from me again with this series. I suppose I should start back with the synopsis. So if you don't know, the series starts out specifically with one character named Aaron, who right at beginning of the story, finds himself within this other world. They wake up and are somewhat disoriented. They don't know where they are. They remember being in our world as we know it, and now they're somewhere else. They find this inn right at the beginning of the story that seems to be abandoned, and they kind of go and make that their home. They start to learn and figure out how to feed themselves and take care of themselves. Eventually they meet other people and start to be introduced to the creatures and beings of this world and start to get orientated. Within the story, they quickly become the innkeeper of this building. It is a chance for them to meet people, connect with people, but also earn money, and again, try to make a living within the scenario that they are finding themselves in. This series, I suppose, could be described as portal fantasy because you have a character who is from our world and goes somewhere else, but it's different than the other portal fantasy I've read because at least as of the point I've read, and again, I'm not caught up, so maybe I'm wrong about this, but we only see the series from within the secondary world, and at this point we've only heard the characters talk about what happens in our world, but we haven't actually seen them go back, and we never get to really see them come. Like basically the first time they're introduced to other characters, as there are different characters brought in throughout the book, each of them we only are introduced once they already have landed within this world. So obviously Erin is the first character we follow, but she is not the last. You have different humans that eventually find their way in. A lot of people struggle with book one, and I fully admit that I'm actually there with them. I started book one, I thought the premise was kind of fun. It plays into some of the video game tropes where you have characters that are leveling up and learning skills and trades and so forth. And it's fun and cute and campy, but Erin, in my opinion, is just a difficult place for the story to start. She has some very unlikable qualities. She makes a lot of mistakes and fumbles, and the story kind of just works in a way that the story kind of goes along, and she always figures her way out of things. But I didn't find her to be the strongest female character. I find her to be perhaps one of the flattest characters in there. I don't hate her like other people do, but I didn't find her beginning as compelling as some of the later characters. So I will be honest, I did something that's probably going to horrify people reading this, is I was about halfway through the first book and I was liking it, but again, for a book that is that long, I typically need to have a lot more motivation to keep going with it. Again, I'm trying to make content, so if I'm spending a lot of time reading a long book that I'm not enjoying, I'm not necessarily going to have much to say on camera, etc. So I wasn't entirely sure if I was going to finish reading the book. I kind of had paused it, and then I got the opportunity to get the audio for book 2, and it wasn't specifically because it was the audio, but it's just the cheapest way to get it because it's either buying the ebook or buying the audiobook, and it went on sale. So anyway, I picked up book 2 and actually started doing the sin that you're never supposed to do. I started reading book 2 even though I wasn't finished book 1. And I will say that book 2 is significantly better. I read through all of book 2 and then actually went back and read the rest of book 1, which, knowing where the story was going, was much more easy to digest. Now, I don't recommend starting with book 2 without at least getting into book 1 because, of course, book 1 introduces a series of characters, and there are significant spoilers that I did come across by reading it out of order. But for me, I needed to know if I wanted to make that investment of my time before doing that. So the part I'll say to you is not necessarily to read it out of order, but when everyone says that the first book is the weakest book, in my opinion, they're right. You kind of have to get through it. You have to like the book to a degree. If you absolutely hate book 1, you won't like the series. It is reminiscent of what is going to come afterwards, but just know that it reads like a debut. It's the weakest installment in my opinion, and each book, as people say, so far has gotten better and better. I really liked book 2, and I loved book 3 even more. As for characters, I don't want to spoil too much because, again, the other characters really get introduced later, but I enjoy the other perspectives, especially the one that got introduced, or the couple, I guess, that got introduced in book 3 right at the beginning of the story, the two individuals that meet, and I just love their relationship, their goals, their motivations. I can definitely see why people get attached to this series because there's a lot of discussion about characters' long-term goals, and it would be so satisfying to see the things that they desire, the levels and progression they are trying to achieve, to actually see that come to light. This is to a degree a progressions fantasy series, but I don't think it leans as heavily into the leveling as other things do. Again, the first book is a bit, in my mind, deceiving that it starts out with a lot of the first character leveling and following her getting better at like making bread and things like that. And while those elements still exist later in the story, they definitely go more into the background, and instead it's just a very character-driven story that is both very humorous and also has some great stakes. So one of the things I think a lot of people, including myself, really like about this series is that it's funny. And I'm someone, if you watch my channel, I can be very picky when it comes to funny books. If a book is funny, I can be really critical of it. Often funny means that it's so lighthearted that there are no stakes. And this book, this series seems to do a good balance of that, where the series has high stakes. There are characters that are in danger and possibly will die. You don't really trust that everyone is going to be there at the end of the series. But at the same time, there's some really funny moments. And again, I don't tend to like funny things in books. I can be a little bit of a straight and narrow reader where I just don't really want the author to make me laugh, or I don't need it. But I definitely found myself chuckling at places. So without really spoiling too much in terms of these specific jokes, but basically what I think the series does best is you have these characters that again are transplanted from our world, trying to explain our world to different creatures. So trying to explain religions like Christianity, trying to explain our forms of sexuality and relationships and dating and all of the things that ensue there. And there's also the introduction of a lot of human foods, because again, that's getting served at the inn. And those elements just feel really cozy and sweet. But at the same time, as I mentioned, this book has some heavy stakes. There are some oh wow moments that I didn't necessarily see coming, or I kind of saw them coming after I read the books out of order, but it made for a really surprising and interesting experience where you're like, oh, this book is taking itself seriously. I want to know where this is going. And so I think it's a good balance of investing myself enough in the story that, again, I want to keep reading. It doesn't feel so slice of life that I feel like I'm reading the exact same thing over and over again. I really care for the characters, their dynamics. I wouldn't necessarily want to binge every book back to back to back, which is why, again, I'm kind of spacing them out, trying to do about one a month. I have several more to go, and I know for those of you that are watching that actually are reading the proper web series, I know that the books that are published are well behind what's available on the web. Probably for the sake of supporting the author, I'm going to continue just to read as they get fully published. So I'll either just again buy the ebook or the audio, just depending on which one's available. And so I'll continue on that way. Again, my intention is to come back with a full series review, but I wanted to give you at least a starting point and idea of how I feel about the series. So it is fun, it's enjoyable, people praise the prose in the series. I find them to be fine, but I'm not reading it for the prose. If I try to compare it to someone like N.K. Jemisin, one of my favorite authors, I don't think that the writing is to that degree, but I don't think the author is trying to be. I think it's better than the average indie published book that doesn't often have the best editing process. So it's good for what it's doing, but just important to go in with those right expectations. And I also want to talk about Grievous Blood by Alexander Darwin. And I'll admit, of the books on this list, this one is not that big. It actually clocks in under 400 pages, but I just got it for review and read it, so I wanted to sneak it into this video anyway. This is the follow-up book to The Combat Codes, also by this author, that came out earlier this year. And by the time you're watching this video, you should have seen my best fantasy of 2023, and that book was on here, and so I'm excited that I've now read the sequel. I read this after I filmed it, so I didn't include it there. This is, of course, an epic martial arts fantasy where we follow this individual who is trained in those ways, and I like the sequel. It was fun, it was easy to spend more time with the characters. I just really enjoy kind of this action-based fantasy. It's something that I don't think I'll enjoy, but then actually do. I would say this is a good sequel, but the ideas are never as fresh in book 2, so I liked it, but it didn't quite have the same highs as the first book. I still think I gave it 4 stars. I enjoyed it, but it didn't have quite the same punch as the first book, pun not really intended. But I like this one. If you want to continue on with the series, I definitely recommend it, and I look forward to reading the next one, which might be the end of the trilogy if it's a trilogy. And finally, let's talk about 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami, yet another really giant book, but in my opinion, worth your time, or at least worth some people's time. So let's get into it. This book is set in 1984 in Tokyo. We follow the story from a few different perspectives. One is this young woman who right at the beginning of the story is talking to this cab driver who gives her some advice which she follows, and by doing so she seems to have fallen into a different version of our world. This is hinted at really early on, and honestly I think that it is more compelling to know that going into the story rather than if you somehow miss it along the way. So very early on she starts to notice that things are almost the same as our world, but not quite. There's certain details, say the style of gun that the officers are wearing, things like that, that just do not match up with her world as she knows it. So slowly she realizes that something is different, something is not quite right, and she has to puzzle out what is happening. We also get the perspective of this author who is rewriting this book that was written by this young woman, and so you see them working together. So the story essentially ends up being this amalgamation of these different perspectives trying to fit together in this strange parallel-like world. Now I should say that I'm choosing to put this book into my fantasy section. I've heard other reviewers describe this as science fiction because of that parallel world element, and while that often can be pulled from a sci-fi idea, in my mind, especially once you start to have the understanding or explanation within the book why the world is the way it is, it feels much more fantastical to me. I don't think the author was trying to pull into quantum theory and things like that. In terms of the story, it was very long. It's told over 3 books, but I was really pulled into the story. The start is very strong. You have the setup, these different characters. You have this one character who's almost like an assassin, and you're trying to figure out what she wants and what she's doing. Eventually, the character perspectives start to intermix and meet, and they're all trying to figure things out, and you have the different motivations and characters figuring things out along the way. I was very enamored by the story. Personally, I am just a sucker for any book that involves that world where it is almost like ours but not quite. I've read several books like these, and they often are my favorites because I find this setup and premise so intriguing. If you have other recommendations, feel free to leave them down below. I'd love to do a whole recommendation video on the topic, but it's tricky because some of these books are a little bit spoilery to mention that they have that aspect. But I just really enjoyed it. I love the puzzling together, the little details and the discoveries, the reveals, all of it I loved. Now, I don't feel like I can do a review of this book without at least acknowledging the squicky parts of this book, for lack of a better word. There are some really uncomfortable subject matter written to this book that was very noticeable in my read. I've seen this book be very polarizing among readers. There are those that love the ideas in this book, which I also love, but then there are readers who cannot get past some of the sexualization within the story. I'm going to go over that without trying to spoil anything, but particularly there is a heavy male gaze in the writing of this book. It definitely feels like the author is leaning into a lot of male stereotypes about authors who are heavily describing breasts and things like that. I do not love those parts of the book. I'm not looking for that in my books, but I do admit that I have read and loved many books before that have that male gaze. And while I'm not loving the book because of that, it doesn't stop me from enjoying the other aspects there. So I was fine with that. Wasn't my favorite, but I could look past it. However, I do admit that there are some really uncomfortable parts in the later part of this book that have to do with consent and sexual acts surrounding people under the age of consent, at least consent in North America, and that made me extremely uncomfortable. Without going into it, I read this book right at the same time that there were some public reveals, which I have discussed in a community post, that came out that deal with individuals doing these sorts of things in our real world, and it was incredibly hard for me to separate what was happening in real life in the news with what was happening in my story. And so while I've said before on my channel, you've seen me say before and again that I will give trigger warnings for other people, but typically I can kind of read anything. This was hard to read because it hit home in a especially personal way that really bothered me. So it definitely took the book down a star. Without those elements, this easily could have been a 5-star read. I loved the story itself, the ideas, all of that. But if I'm honest, I could not fully forgive the book for choosing to have certain subject matter, certain elements and aspects and scenes in the story that in my opinion weren't necessary. You could have aged up the characters, you could have done things a little bit differently and still told the same story without making me sick to my stomach over the choices the author was making. So I need to give that huge disclaimer. Some people may want to steer clear of this book simply because they cannot read that, and definitely it's a subject matter I'm not looking for in my books, but it's such a beloved book for so many other reasons. It hit on a lot of my buzzwords in terms of that parallel, almost our world type setting, and those elements it did fulfill. But unfortunately, I am leaving this review a little bit mixed because I love this book so much, but I cannot blindly recommend it to all of you because you have to go into it knowing if you can handle or are even interested in diving into a book that is going to touch some very uncomfortable subject matter that, again, didn't really have to be there. Kind of a disappointment there. But again, I admit that I could not stop thinking about this book after I finished it, and still to this day, I am still obsessed with the story itself. So I just wish I could give a more blanket recommendation for this book. I hope that some of you check it out if you're curious. I hope some of you steer clear if you are not, and I will respect you either way as long as you can respect me and my strange, uncomfortable reading taste. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know, of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And please, down below in the comments, let me know what is a really big chunky book that you think is worth everyone's time. I think a lot of times people are really intimidated by big books and tend to pick up smaller books. Again, you can get through more. It looks better on your Goodreads count at the end of the year. But there are so many great big books, and often, again, they end up being favorites of the year. So if you have a favorite, recommend it in the comments and we'll talk about it then. If you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and I hope you stick around and subscribe. If you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a thumbs up, drop a comment, even if just an emoji like a big book. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.